Montana Territory, 1878. The first stone hit her shoulder just as she passed the edge of the livery barn. Mara Oakes flinched but kept walking, her boots crunching over frozen mud. Another stone clipped her elbow. She did not turn around. She knew better. The jeers followed her like a second shadow. "Which girl?" someone shouted. "Go back to the woods where you belong." She did not answer. The cold bit through her threadbare shawl, but it was the sharp slice of shame that stung worse. She walked faster, head down, the late October wind threading through her long dark hair as she left the edge of town behind. They would not forgive her for what her mother had done. Not ever. She climbed the hill that overlooked the town of Dry Creek and sank into the tall grass, breathing hard. Her fingers trembled with cold and something else, rage, maybe. Or grief. It was hard to tell them apart these days. The sky was low and gray, snow in the air. She had no home, no family, and no reason to stay in Dry Creek. But where else could she go? The townspeople had buried her mother just outside the cemetery fence last year like she was a dog, not a woman. Said she was a witch. Said she had lured men with herbs and spells. Said Mara was just the same. They were wrong. But being right did not matter. She pulled her knees to her chest and watched the trail that wound out toward the mountains. If she had a horse, she would take it. If she had coin, she would find the next train west. If she had anything at all, she would not be here alone, cold, and hated. By the time the sun slipped behind the trees, her body was stiff with cold. She stood and turned toward the woods, where she had made a rough lean-to out of branches and tarps. It kept the worst weather off, but not much else. That was when she saw the smoke. A thin, curling strand rising from the trees below. Someone was camped near her shelter. Mara turned slow, cautious. She moved quiet as a deer, picking her way through the trees. When she reached the edge of the clearing, she froze. A man stood over a crackling fire, feeding it dry pine branches. His coat was dusted with trail dirt, his hat tilted low, and his horse was tied nearby, saddlebags full. A real cowboy, from the look of him. He moved like someone who had known the trail a long time, slow and sure, not looking around like he expected trouble, but not careless either. She almost turned back. Then the wind shifted, and the smell of stew hit her nose. Her stomach clenched hard. He looked up. Their eyes met. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not shout. Instead, he said, "You lost." His voice was calm, steady. Deep. Mara hesitated. "No. You hungry?" She could not answer. Her throat was too tight. He held her gaze a long beat, then motioned toward the fire. "There's enough for two." She stepped into the clearing. Her legs were shaking. He took one look at her, the too thin frame, the bruises on her arm, the haunted look in her eyes, and nodded like he understood everything already. "I'm Fletcher McGraw. Mara Oakes." He ladled stew into a tin bowl and handed it to her. She sat on a log, cradling the warmth in her hands. The first bite made her eyes sting worse than the cold ever had. He did not ask what she was running from. She did not ask why he was camped here. That night, they sat in silence around the fire. The flames lit his face in flickers, sharp cheekbones, a faint line at the corner of his mouth, eyes that had seen too much. He was maybe 28, maybe 30. Older than her, but not by much. She was 19, though she felt ancient most days. She did not sleep in her lean-to. He offered her a blanket near the fire, and she took it without a word. She stayed on one side of the flames, and he stayed on the other. When she woke the next morning, he was still there. "Where are you headed?" she asked as he packed his bedroll. "Nowhere in particular." She watched him throw a saddle over his horse. "You passing back through town?" "No," he looked at her. "I do not go where folks are cruel." Her throat tightened. He paused. Then added, I could use some company on the trail, if you felt like moving on. Mara stared at him. You don't even know me. He shrugged once. I know enough. She hesitated. Then she nodded. They rode out together an hour later. She rode behind him on his horse, arms wrapped around his waist, the wind cold on her cheeks. They did not speak much. But she felt something strange in her chest when he looked back at her and smiled, not with pity, not with suspicion. Just real warmth. That night, they camped near a creek. Fletcher taught her how to set a snare and how to tell which berries were safe. When she burned her hand trying to lift the kettle from the fire, he took her hand gently, wrapping it in a clean cloth from his saddlebag. You always carry bandages? She asked. Some folks need more patching than others. She looked at him. He did not flinch from her gaze. You one of those folks? She asked. Used to be. They were quiet a while. The fire burned low. Then he said, You don't have to tell me what happened. But I reckon you did not deserve it. Her voice came out small. They think I'm like my mother. He waited. She helped people. Sick ones. Hurt ones. With herbs and teas. But when the pastor's wife died after childbirth, they blamed her. Her voice cracked. Said she cursed her. Fletcher's jaw tightened. She wasn't a witch. She was just kind. He nodded once. Kindness scares some people. Mara blinked fast. He handed her a blanket. Their fingers brushed. That night, they slept a little closer to the fire. By the end of the third day, she was laughing. Really laughing. He told stories about towns he had passed through, people he had met, a horse that once kicked him into a river. She laughed so hard she nearly dropped her plate. He watched her with a look that made her chest warm. On the fourth night, they shared a blanket. She did not pull away when he brushed her hair back from her cheek. His hand was rough, careful. Her heart pounded. You keep looking at me like that, he said, voice low, and I am going to kiss you. She whispered, maybe I want you to. When his mouth touched hers, it was slow and sure and warm. And it felt like the first real thing in her life. Mara curled into his chest that night, his arm around her waist, and for the first time in years, she was not cold. She was not alone. She was wanted. And she was safe. They followed the Bitterroot foothills west, where the pine grew thick and the wind had less room to wound. The first snow hadn't fallen yet, just a dusting here and there in the shadows, but the air had that stillness before winter settles in for good. Fletcher rode with easy quiet, his hands steady on the reins. Mara sat behind him, wrapped in wool and thought. Midday on the fifth day, they came across a half-collapsed trapper's cabin tucked back in a stand of tamarack. The roof leaned a little, but the hearth was still whole, and the stone chimney stood tall against the cold sky. Fletcher dismounted, tested the door, then turned back toward her. We ain't gonna do better than this tonight, he said. You all right staying under a roof again? She stepped off the horse and stretched her legs, eyeing the sagging eaves. It's not much worse than what I had before. Inside, it smelled of old smoke and pine pitch. Fletcher cleared out the broken chair and swept leaves from the corner with a pine branch. Mara gathered wood while he relit the hearth, coaxing flame from dry moss and cedar bark. By evening, the fire was crackling strong, shadows dancing across the log walls. She sat near the edge of the warmth, legs tucked beneath her, watching him repair a broken tin lantern with a bit of wire. His fingers worked sure and patient, like he'd fixed 1,000 things that didn't want mending. You always ride alone? She asked. He set the lantern down, tested the hinge. I used to ride with a freight crew out of Helena. Got tired of other men's tempers and too many nights with a knife under my bedroll. She traced a knot in the floorboards with her fingertip. So you left. He leaned back against the wall. Didn't feel like killing someone just to stay alive. She looked up at him. That's not a small thing. He met her eyes. Neither is trusting someone again. The lantern caught the lines near his mouth, the quiet tiredness around his eyes. She wondered what had carved it there, what kind of betrayal, what kind of grief. But she didn't ask. It was enough that he was here now. Her hands were warmer than they'd been in weeks. Later, she boiled water in a dented kettle while Fletcher cut strips of dried meat for stew. She watched the way he moved, not one motion wasted, like everything he did had been learned the hard way. When he handed her a spoon, their fingers touched again. The moment held a little longer this time. "You thinking about heading all the way to Fort Owen?" he asked after a while. She stirred the pot quietly. "I don't know what I'm thinking." He nodded once, like that made sense. "I hear they've got a schoolhouse and a doctor now. Settlers coming in steady." She blew on a spoonful of stew. "I can't teach. Don't know enough." "Don't have to be a teacher to be useful," he said. "They always need hands to sew, cook, patch up sick folks. If you know plants, that's something. There's a difference between knowing things and people letting you use it." He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I'd vouch for you." She looked at him. "That means something out here. To the right folks." She tucked that away, unsure what to say. No one had ever offered her the weight of their name before. She wasn't even sure what it felt like, only that something inside her settled at the thought. That night, the wind picked up. Cold scraped along the cabin walls, but the fire held strong. Fletcher laid out his bedroll and motioned for her to take the warmer side, near the hearthstone. She hesitated, then lay down beside him. They didn't speak, just breathed slow and even, listening to the quiet hush of snow beginning to fall outside. Sometime deep in the night, Mara woke to his hand resting near hers, not touching, just close. She turned her palm up, let her fingers brush his. He didn't pull away. "Fletcher," she whispered. "Yeah. Do you think people can change what they're meant for?" His voice came after a long pause. "I think some are born to survive what others wouldn't. That don't make them wrong. Just stronger." She closed her eyes. The fire popped, soft and steady. She let her fingers curl into his. By morning, the snow had coated the trees in silence. Fletcher stepped outside first, boots crunching through the white. Mara watched him from the doorway, hat low, rifle slung across his back as he checked the trail. When he came back in, he shook the snow from his shoulders and set down 2 rabbits he'd snared. "We got food for another day," he said. "Could stay a little longer." She nodded, pulling the kettle closer to the coals. "I don't mind stopping, if you don't." He glanced at her then, something gentle behind the tiredness in his eyes. "No hurry." They stayed 3 days in the trapper's cabin. By the last, she had made a quilt from old flour sacks and his spare shirts. He found her humming once, fingers moving sure through the stitches. She didn't notice him watching. On the 4th morning, they packed the horse and left the cabin behind. The trail ahead was quiet beneath the snow, trees heavy with white. Fletcher looked back at her once as they rode, not to ask if she was all right, not to check if she kept up. Just to see her. And she looked back. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. They reached the valley by late afternoon, where the hills dipped and gave way to cleared pasture and a narrow road that bore wagon ruts worn deep from seasons of use. The snow had melted low in the valley, leaving behind wet patches and the smell of thawing earth. Fletcher pulled the horse to a stop near a fork in the trail. One path bent west along the Clearwater River, the other wound south toward a mission town nestled beneath the bluffs. Mara slid down first, boots sinking into the damp soil. She adjusted the strap of the satchel she'd stitched from canvas and hide scraps. Fletcher dismounted beside her, his coat damp around the hem, and let the reins hang loose while the horse drank from a shallow stream. He looked down the south trail. "There's a trading post 3 miles ahead. Might be able to sell those pelts. She nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. We could use more flour. We'll have enough left over for a room, if you'd rather sleep with a roof tonight. Mara hesitated. You think they'd take kindly to me? He took his time answering. I can scout ahead first. Folks treat you different when they think you're with someone. Her brows lifted slightly. That what we are? His eyes didn't waver. If you want it to be. The quiet held between them, filled only by the soft rush of water and the creak of saddle leather. Then she said, I'd like to try. They walked the rest of the way, leading the horse between them. The town was small, no more than a dozen buildings stretched along the creek. A smithy, a mill, 2 shops, and a chapel with a lopsided bell tower. A boy in a wool cap ran past them carrying a basket of kindling, and a woman called after him from a porch, apron flapping in the wind. Fletcher tied the horse outside the trading post and ducked inside while Mara lingered by the hitching rail, watching the movement of folks with the cautious eye of someone who had been watched too long herself. A man with tobacco-stained fingers squinted at her from under the brim of his hat, but said nothing. She turned away. When Fletcher came back out, he handed her a muslin sack tied with twine. Got flour, salt, and 2 tins of beans. The innkeeper's wife said we could have the back room if we help with firewood. Mara looked at him. You told her I was with you. He nodded once. Didn't lie, if that's what you're asking. She followed him across the muddy lane to the inn, a squat building with a crooked chimney and smoke curling from every window. Inside, warmth hit her like a wave stew simmering, boots drying by the hearth, voices low and worn with winter. A girl barely older than Mara swept the floor, and an older man with a gray beard nodded as they entered, then pointed toward the stairs. The room was small, the ceiling low, but it held a feather bed and a quilt stitched from dozens of faded calico squares. Mara set her satchel down and turned slowly, taking in the shelf of willow-patterned dishes, the wooden washbasin, the window that looked out toward the river bend. Fletcher stood by the door, hat in hand. You all right? He asked. She nodded. It's strange. What is? Not being afraid. He watched her for a long moment, then said, You don't have to be, anymore. That night, after they helped stack wood behind the kitchen, they ate at a small table in the corner, shoulder to shoulder while the rest of the room filled with the clink of spoons and the low murmur of folks who knew each other's names. A boy played a fiddle near the hearth, slow and uneven. Mara listened with her chin in her hand, her eyes softer than he'd seen them. Afterward, Fletcher walked her upstairs. The lantern flickered as he lit it, casting warm amber light across the sloped ceiling. She sat on the edge of the bed and unlaced her boots, fingers moving slow. He leaned against the doorframe. You want me to stay down in the stable? She looked up. Do you want to? No. She set her boots aside. Then stay. He crossed the room and sat beside her. The bed creaked under his weight. I was thinking, she said, about what comes next. He turned toward her. I don't want to drift forever, she said. I want a place to plant something. Maybe not yet. But someday. I've thought about settling, Fletcher said. Land's cheaper near the Flathead line. Good soil, water close. You'd do that? If I had someone to build with. Mara reached for his hand. You do. He held her gaze, and something deep in his chest shifted, slow and certain. He leaned forward and kissed her steady, reverent. Not like the first time, and not like he'd ever have to wonder again. That night, they lay beneath the patchwork quilt, the lantern turned low, her head tucked beneath his chin, his hand resting at the small of her back. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a whisper, but inside, everything was still. By morning, the ground had frozen again, and the chimney smoke rose straight into a sky the color of hammered tin. Fletcher saddled the horse, and Mara tucked a note under the pillow in the inn's little room, just her name, written neat and small, folded twice. She didn't need to run anymore. They rode north, toward the land he had spoken of, where the soil drank deep and the winters were long but honest. Where a cabin could rise from the earth with time and care. Where a girl who had once been shunned could dig her hands into spring and grow something lasting. They didn't look back. There was nothing left behind them worth missing. Only the long road ahead, and the quiet, steady promise of each other. They reached the edge of the Flathead land by early November. The cottonwoods had dropped their last leaves, and the riverbanks held a thin skin of ice that crackled under hoof. Fletcher led the horse along a narrow trail that knifed through willow brush, the mountains distant but clear in the crisp air. Mara walked beside him, skirts tucked up and boots damp from creek crossings. Her face had filled out some, color returning to her cheeks, but she still glanced behind them now and then, as if expecting someone to call her back. "Been thinking about the land north of the Mission Range," Fletcher said after a stretch of silence. "Flat, open. Good for first planting." Mara kept her eyes on the trail. "You think we could get a claim stake before winter?" "Depends if the agent's still up at the outpost. Might be we winter nearby and file come spring." She nodded, thoughtful. He glanced over. "You ever build from scratch?" "I helped raise a small barn once. My mother traded salves for labor, but we did the finishing ourselves, roofing, corners, even the hinges." He looked impressed. "You remember how?" "I remember enough to know I'd rather use a level than guess by eye." That drew a short laugh from him, low and genuine. She smiled, then looked away, not used to being the one who made someone laugh. Before dusk, they came upon a small cluster of cabins near the river's bend. Smoke rose from two chimneys, and a pair of goats wandered behind a crude fence. A Nez Perce woman in a wool shawl stood outside a lodgepole structure, splitting kindling with a small axe. She raised her chin as they approached. Fletcher tipped his hat. "Evening." The woman studied them, then pointed toward the far cabin without a word. Fletcher nodded and led Mara that way, where a bearded man with a deep scar along his jaw leaned against the porch rail, whittling something from a crooked stick. "We're looking to winter nearby," Fletcher said. "Don't need much, just ground and quiet." The man spat into the snow beside the steps. "You'll pay in work. If it's honest." The man jerked his head toward a shed with a sagging roof. "Fix that and clear the south fence line. You can set your bedrolls in the woodshed till snow deepens." Fletcher looked to Mara. She nodded once. "Fair deal," Fletcher said. They spent the next 2 days mending the shed, sawing new braces from pine and lifting the roof back into place with a makeshift pulley. Mara worked beside him, sleeves rolled past her elbows, hands raw but steady. She didn't flinch from splinters or the cold, and when the end of the second day came, she stood back and said, "It'll last 5 winters, maybe 6. He watched her brush sawdust from her skirt. "You want it to be more than just this?" She turned toward him. "What do you mean?" "This drifting from one job to the next. Trading labor for space. You want to stop, settle. I want a place with my name on something. Even if it's just a door I built." He nodded. "Then we'll find it." That night, they slept inside the woodshed, wrapped in blankets, their breath visible in the air. Near dawn, a coyote howled far off, and Mara stirred, her back warm against his chest. "Do you miss anyone?" she asked quietly. He took a moment. "My brother. Died in Kansas after the war. Never stopped looking for peace." She traced the grain of the floorboards beside her. "I thought if I left Dry Creek, I'd stop feeling like I had something to prove." "You don't." "I know. But I still feel it." He shifted to face her. "You're not what they said you were." "I know that too. It's just hard to forget how they looked at me." He didn't speak over that. Just reached and took her hand, slow and certain. They stayed until first snow layered the roof thick enough to dull sound. Fletcher cleared the fence line in 2 days, hauling fallen branches and mending breaks with wire and willow where he could. Mara spent her afternoons in the neighbor woman's kitchen, trading help for dried corn and lard. She learned the names of the two goats Ash and Juniper, and once, when the woman handed her a carved spoon with the word, "Welcome," burned into the handle, Mara held it for a long time before tucking it in her apron. One evening, Fletcher came in with a wrapped parcel under his arm. "What's that?" Mara asked. He set it on the table and opened the cloth. Inside was a ledger book, blank and bound in worn leather. "For what's ours," he said. "When we find the land." She ran her fingers over the cover. "You think we'll make it through the winter?" He looked at her then, not with doubt or worry, just quiet assurance. "We've already made it through the worst of it." She met his eyes, and something deep within her steadied. Not with sudden certainty, but with the kind of slow, rooted hope that grows when there's no need to pretend. Outside, snow fell in thick silence. Inside, they sat close, the fire low, the ledger between them. Neither said it, but both knew they weren't drifting anymore. By mid-December, the snow lay thick across everything, softening the lines of the world until even the blackened stumps looked gentle. The days passed quiet and full, chopping wood, hauling water, stitching new soles onto worn-out boots. Fletcher built a drying rack above the hearth where Mara strung bundles of sage and yarrow, traded from the Nez Perce woman in exchange for help mending a torn winter coat. On the coldest mornings, she woke before the light came in, listening to Fletcher breathe steady beside her. She never used to like silence, not after Dry Creek, but now it felt like something sacred earned, not empty. Fletcher carved small things in the evenings when the wind pressed against the walls. A spoon, a pipe stem, a little horse with bent legs. He wasn't much for talking after dark, but when he did, it was always something worth keeping. "You ever think about what you'd name a place?" he asked once, holding the horse carving in his palm. Mara set aside the patch she was working on and looked at him. "Not the kind of thing I let myself think about before." "Think about it now." She tilted her head. "Larkspur. That's what I'd call it." He raised his brows. "Like the flower?" "My mother planted them once. They grew wild where nothing else did." Fletcher ran his thumb over the little horse's back. "Larkspur it is." The next day, he rode out to the agent's outpost with the bearded man from the riverside cabin. He left at dawn and didn't return until the light had begun to go. Mara stood outside with her shawl pulled tight, watching the trail. When he rode back in, cheeks wind-burned and eyes bright, he handed her a folded paper with her name written carefully across the bottom. "North Lot," he said. "By the creek bend. 20 acres. It's ours come spring." She held the paper in both hands, fingers going still. "Ours?" He dismounted. "I put your name first." She looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." Inside, she laid the paper on the table and pressed her palm flat against it. Fletcher poured water into the kettle, moving slow, watching her. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I never had anything that wasn't given with conditions," she said quietly. "You're the first person who's never asked me to be anyone else." "You're enough just like this," he said. She stepped toward him, hands trembling, and touched his chest, just over his heart. "I want to stay," she said. "Not just through winter. I want to build with you. I want the first fence post and the last stone in the chimney and the way the porch creaks when we're old." He reached up and cupped her cheek, rough thumb brushing the corner of her mouth. "You will," he said. "We'll have all of it." That night, they lay wrapped in one another, the fire low, the wind whispering through the chinked logs. Her head rested over his heartbeat, his hand cradling the curve of her waist. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to ask. By late March, the snow melted in heavy sloughs, revealing patches of earth soft enough to turn. Fletcher felled lodgepole pine and stripped bark, while Mara cleared brush and marked the boundary lines with stones they gathered from the riverbank. The neighbors helped raise the first wall of the cabin, and Fletcher bartered 2 cured hides for a door with iron hinges. By the time the cherry blossoms bloomed pale along the edge of the water, the roof was on and the hearthstone laid. On a warm afternoon, Mara stood barefoot on the plank floor, smoothing her hand along the windowsill Fletcher had carved. It looked out onto the pasture where they planned to keep goats come summer. She turned as he entered, a woven basket of eggs in one hand. "Neighbor traded these for the rest of your salve," he said, setting them down. She crossed the room and took his hand. "We should plant tomorrow," she said. "Squash and beans first." He nodded. "We'll start early." They stepped outside together, the porch still unfinished, but strong enough to hold them. Above, the sky stretched wide and blue, the last of the frost gone from the air. Mara leaned against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her waist. "You ever think about how far you've come?" he asked. "I try not to look back." He kissed her temple. "Then just look ahead." They stood like that until the sun dipped behind the hills, the world gone quiet but for the creek and the wind through the grass. The cabin held their warmth now, their work, their names carved into the ridge beam together. Mara hung the carved horse by the door, and Fletcher placed the ledger on the shelf beside the dried herbs and the folded deed. They didn't speak of forever, not because they were afraid, but because they'd already begun. Every nail set, every seed planted, every soft look across the table was a promise made real. And in the years that followed, as goats bleated in the pasture and a garden rose wild and full beneath the window, they built a life not from escape or fear, but from the simple, steady knowing of one another. It was not perfect. It was better. It was theirs.